Hello, this is Miss Lay, and I'm going to be reading chapter 15 of Serafina and the Twisted Staff. As Serafina fell through midair, she reached out and grabbed desperately. She caught hold of the girder's edge just in time, stopping her fall. She hung down into the darkness above the chasm, clinging to the girder by her fingers. The black void loomed below her like a giant mouth, waiting for her to drop into it. The cold, gritty, sharp edge of the steel girder felt like it was going to cut her fingers off. But letting go would be the end of her. All the while, hundreds of creatures flew around her, hissing and clicking, swarming through the attic like a black tornado. Gritting her teeth, she swung her legs and wrapped them around the girder. She hung there, upside down. She pulled herself up onto the top of the girder, then crouched down to defend herself from the flying creatures. The hissing grew in intensity. One creature struck the side of her head with a thump, clinging to her scalp and hair, its wings batting. Then another struck her in the face, and she swatted it away. 3 more clung to her back. Another struck her neck and bit into her skin. Snarling in pain and anger, Serafina grabbed it against her neck and crushed it in her hand. Then she looked at the dead body that she held. She couldn't believe it. It made no sense. They were chimney swifts. These flying creatures were akin to bats in many ways, but they were actually dark, scaly, hissing little birds. They spent most of their time in the air at dusk, but when they landed, they couldn't perch. Instead, they clung to the inside of chimneys and caves with their tiny, sharp feet. Their tails were not feathers, but spines. The swifts had filled the attic, thousands of them, coating the girders and the walls like a gray, spiny, feathered, hissing, chattering skin. Suddenly, the sublation of the swifts rose into a crescendo of rasping sound, and they all burst into the air inside the attic, a great swirling cloud of them swarming around her. They hurled their bodies against her, clinging at her with their tiny scaly feet, pecking at her with their sharp beaks, their spiny tails digging into her face, their wings batting and tangling up in her hair. The torrent of swifts was so thick around her that she could not hear or see. She would soon lose track of her position. She wanted to hunker down and curl into a ball and cover her face and head, but she knew if she did that, she'd never get out. So she kept fighting, flailing her arms and pulling the creatures off her. Eyes almost closed for protection, she desperately looked around for an escape. Seeing a girder between her and the ladder, she took a leap and managed to just land on it. From there, she pushed her way along the girder, through the clouds of birds. She finally came to the ladder and climbed down as fast as she could, fighting the attacking birds all the way. At last, she pushed her way through the panel at the back of the cabinet and came rolling out, breathless and terrified, into the 3rd floor corridor. She spun around and slammed the panel shut with her shoulder, closing the swifts behind her. For several seconds she just lay there, catching her breath, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Chimney swifts were strange, crepuscular little creatures, but they were normally harmless. She'd seen them flying their cheerful chirping, mosquito-catching aerobatics above Biltmore's roof at sunset many times. Why did they now swarm and attack her? She'd been living in this house, crawling in these passages her entire life, and they'd always left her alone. Why was this happening now? Was the house itself turning against her? She looked around her. The house was dark and quiet. It was well after midnight, and everyone was asleep. Still feeling scared and shaky from what had happened, she got up onto her feet. She stood unsteadily for a moment, recovering. Then she brushed herself off and pulled the feathers and dead swifts out of her hair. When she heard a creak in the distance, she stopped, half in a panic that the attack was going to start all over again, but nothing came. She started walking through the darkness. She followed the corridor and passed through the living hall with its sofas, chairs, and tables. Earlier, several of the guests had been enjoying their tea here, but now it was eerily dark, empty, and still. It was like they had all disappeared. A terrible chill went down her spine. What if Braden was gone? And Mr. and Mrs. Vanderbilt, and all the guests? What if they were all gone? Maybe she was the last one, the only one to survive the attack. What if everyone else in the house was dead? She heard another sound. It wasn't a creak this time, but a footstep, and then another. Somewhere in the house, someone was awake. It felt like someone was following her, lingering in the shadows behind her. When she reached the top of the grand staircase, moonlight shone through the rising cascade of slanting, leaded glass windows, casting silver blue light across the wide, gently arcing steps and the filigreed railing that spiraled up through Biltmore's floors. Attached to a copper dome at the very top of the staircase, an ornate wrought iron chandelier hung down through the center of the magnificent spiral. As she headed down the staircase, the black shadow of her body in the moonlight moved along the outer wall like a strange crawling animal. Then she heard something coming up the stairway toward her. She stopped, uncertain what she was hearing. Her heart beat faster, and her breaths grew shorter and more intense. It wasn't a small noise or a single step or two. Someone was definitely coming up the stairs. Her muscles jittered, preparing her for battle. Her mind kept telling her to get a hold of itself. It could just be one of Biltmore's guests or a servant. But then she realized that her instincts were telling her something. The sound wasn't human. She sucked in a breath and crouched down, ready to leap. Whatever it was, she could hear the creature's feet clicking and scraping on the limestone steps. It had 4 legs and claws. Her chest pulled in air at a steady, rapid pace. She could feel every muscle in her body coming alive, ready to fight. She began backing slowly up the stairs until she reached the upper landing, making as little noise as possible. But it was coming fast, gaining on her. She could hear it growling now, coming even faster. Its multi-legged shadow traveled up the outer wall like a giant spider. Just when she was about to turn and run, it came up onto the landing and into sight. But it wasn't a spider. It was a black dog. The dog paused and then began to move slowly toward her, stalking her, its head low as it snarled and growled. She backed up as it came toward her. As it approached, she realized it wasn't one of the wolfhounds or some other dog. It was her friend, Gideon. Much relieved, she let out a long breath. She smiled and relaxed. "Gideon," she said happily, thinking that he must have mistaken her for an intruder. But the dog snarled and kept moving toward her, his body tense and coiled, ready to spring. A new fear grew within her. Her chest tightened. "Gideon, it's me," she said again, rising desperation in her voice. "Come on, Gideon, it's me." But Gideon did not recognize her. Her body flushed with heat. The large black dog with its pointed ears kept coming slowly toward her, snarling, its teeth bared now, its canines snapping. It was the most terrifying snarl she'd ever heard. Gideon burst into an attack, growling as he leapt into the air straight at her. He slammed into her body, biting into her shoulder and knocking her backward off her feet. She hit the stone floor with a painful slam, her head hitting so hard that she nearly blacked out. Then she twisted and spun and punched her way out from under the dog's legs. "Stop this, Gideon," she cried as she leapt away. "Gideon, it's me, it's Serafina." But the dog leapt again, biting her arm and shaking her as he growled. The only other time she'd ever seen Gideon this fierce was when he was fighting the man in the black cloak. It was like she had suddenly become the evil one. "Gideon, no, stop!" she cried as she smashed her fists into the dog's face to get him to release her. She kicked and screamed and finally twisted away from him. He immediately pressed the attack, snapping at her legs as she scurried away. She ducked and darted, but wherever she went, he followed. He was incredibly fast. She kept dodging him, but she could not shake him. She didn't want to fight him, but he just kept on coming. He bit her again and again, his canines clamping onto her leg. With a ferocious tug, he pulled her off her feet, then charged in at her throat. She blocked her neck and rolled away, then leapt to her feet, and he immediately struck her and took her down again. She didn't want to hurt her friend, but she didn't want to die either. She couldn't keep going. She couldn't keep fighting him. He was an incredible warrior and filled with a terrific rage, the likes of which she'd never ever seen. Something had twisted him, deranged him, turned him into a rabid beast that did not recognize her, and he was wearing her down. She could tell that she wasn't going to last much longer. She fended off one more attack and then turned and fled back toward the top of the stairs as fast as she could. Outraged by her attempt to escape, the growling Doberman charged after her with shocking speed. Just as she reached the railing, the dog leapt through the air, its fang-filled mouth open wide for the bite.